Okay, so now we're going to talk about, in this lecture, about socioeconomic status and classism. So before we move forward, we're going to have to know some really important terms. The first one is class. So when we think about class, it can mean different things. But for the purposes of this course, class is going to refer to this relative social ranking that's based on your wealth, your status, education, and power. And so moving on about wealth, wealth is basically what you own minus what you owe. So if you own investments and if you own homes, you subtract that from what you owe. And the difference of that is your wealth. As far as income is basically any resources that come from your wages, from your investments, any government benefits, or other sources that comes in periodically. Class culture. This one is basically where there is a quote unquote culture around shared within people of a similar class position. So these include norms, these include values, and different ways of life. When you think about cultural capital, these are specific sets of knowledge, skills, language, and the way to present yourself that acts as a marker of class. So based upon what you know, how you speak, and the skills and how you present yourself gives off an indication of what social class, excuse me, not social class, what economic class you're part of. With social capital, all that is social networks that a person tends to be a part of and one that a person has access to. When we think about socioeconomic status, how we understand it is rather difficult. And I say that because how people define socioeconomic status is very different. For the purposes of this course, we're going to use it in this way. The total measure of your work experience in your individual family and family's economic and social position in relation to others. So when we think about classism, this is more along the lines of systemic, interpersonal, cultural, and individual sets of practices and beliefs that assign different values to people based on their socioeconomic class. Now, something to look at when we're looking at the Hayes addressing model here. So when we think about social status, those with money are part of the privileged group. Well, we have to be careful with that because you can still have money and still experience oppression and class oppression. And what I mean by that is when you think about people who are middle class or working class, while there is some economic privilege, it's not to the same extent as someone who has not generational wealth, but someone who is upper class. So why are we talking about classism? Well, within recent years, people have recognized how big of an impact classism has on the working class and people in poverty. So first one, lack of access to resources. When we think about healthcare and education, these are two of the main big things. When you have what we know with education and with access to health, there's the greater chances of economic mobility and granted less payments to the doctor because you're sick. Well, when you think about lack of access to these resources, these not only facilitate while they're also facilitated by classism. Let me go back. So because of these lack of resources or lack of access to these resources, people are not able to get the healthcare that they really need. So in turn, they're not going to the doctor because it's too expensive, and then they're getting sicker, and then sicker and sicker and sicker until they die, or they develop another chronic disease, so forth and so on. This also goes hand in hand with psychological health, not having access to a therapist, right? A person who might be experiencing some rather critical psychological concerns, they're not able to see a therapist, and then in turn they stress over that, and then that facilitates their symptoms related to that psychological concern. A downward or stagnant mobility. So when we think about classism and when we talk about meritocracy, it's going to make a little bit more sense. With classism, it keeps a person at their economic mobility or at their economic position, or it moves them further down. And there are certain power structures that operate within classism that keep this hierarchical position or this hierarchical nature. So we're going to talk about that when we get to meritocracy. Hold on to that thought. But if you're born in 2008, in 2008, there was a really bad recession where you had many US Americans lose their job. And in losing their job, we're losing access to healthcare, losing access to education, or resources for education, right? And so when we think about classism, while a lot of people who are within the working class, to some extent, the middle class and people in poverty, they were greatly impacted by this. Well, everybody across economic positions were impacted. Those who were disproportionately impacted were those who were in the working class and the middle class and those in poverty. So all that to say is that when we think about the impact of classism, it disproportionately disadvantages people who are not in the upper class. Even further, with classism, it facilitates discrimination and stereotypes. So when we think about how we understand or how we conceptualize homelessness, how we think about working class folks, middle class folks, and even further, upper class folks, we have different images in our mind. And so I want you to know what image came up for you when I said each of these different economic statuses. And think about how those images are also facilitated by other systems of oppression. And it's something to make note, how we understand these stereotypes, whether they're positive or negative, facilitates how we act towards people who are within those economic positions. When we look at homelessness, right? Research has examined it as a conceivable stigmatized identity. To some extent, depending upon how a person can make it conceivable, a person is less likely to experience outwardly discrimination. However, when that identity is known, people are more likely to experience discriminatory behaviors. So there was a study that was done in 2020, is by Weiss and colleagues. And what they did, they examined people who were homeless and people who had racial ethnic minority identities. And so what was found is that people who are homeless, they did report greater experiences when their homelessness identity was known. And people who were both homeless and also a person of color also reported greater anticipated stigma and discriminatory behaviors around their identities. So we know that, yes, there is discrimination against people who are homeless, and even further, when there are multiple marginalized identities, this creates further anticipated stigma. And we know with research that anticipated stigma is a predictor of psychological distress. So they're experiencing greater amounts of distress. So we talked about the impacts of classism very broadly. We're going to talk about the myths around classism. I mentioned meritocracy several times in the last slide. So how we understand meritocracy is this belief that if you work hard, you're able to become successful. If you work hard enough, you can achieve economic success. However, when we're looking within classism, meritocracy is a myth. It facilitates shaming of people who are working or doing their best to, survive. So if we look here at this picture here, down here, this explains meritocracy in a nutshell. So you have two young people, you have Jim and you have Sony. And you see Sony being scolded by their teacher or whoever this person is. So they're saying, stop making excuses. You're just not working hard enough. Note, both boys have 150. But the difference is that Jim, going into his home, there are, it's a two-parent household. And they're also both facilitating in his engagement. When you look at Sony, based on this picture, and I hate to assume this, comes from a single parent household who says, make sure to come home after school to take care of his sister, of the baby, right? So when we look at Jim, also even further, and Sony, they both have that basic education. However, Jim has more access to the latest IT tools, tutors, best books that money could buy, enrichment programs. And so while both boys have a IQ of 150, Jim is closer to achieving the success based upon his experiences. And to some extent, his family's socioeconomic background. And so when we look at Sony, while Sony has that basic education, he doesn't have that access to the same resources as Jim. And so here, when we put this teacher's comment in perspective, it's shaming Sony for not working hard enough when systemically he could not. So when we think about meritocracy, it shames people into why they couldn't achieve. And part of why they couldn't achieve comes from, not from part, all of that comes from lack of access to these extra resources. Now, something that I don't want us to get away from is blaming a system. It is blaming a system when if you didn't do the work, you didn't do the work. What I'm saying is this should not completely destroy personal responsibility. We all have personal responsibility, but it's to the extent that what can we do? What can we do and what we cannot systemically do? So meritocracy, and I'll be very clear, it blames that individual for not being able to do well enough. So the next time when you hear about pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, remember that there are things that are systemically in place. And let's also think about a time when you have heard that. What happened? What was the context? What did you think at that time? What do you think now? So something to reflect on. Conflation with democracy and capitalism. So when we think about this in particular, right, democracy, a very big, I was about to say very big thing in our country, and it is. And that's not to take away from that. What we tend to see is that with the rise, or not even rise, with the promotion of capitalism and the engagement of capitalism in a capitalistic society, we place money and the needs of business owners and billionaire people over the needs of others. That's where we need to be concerned. So when we think about democracy is this freedom to engage and to do what you need to do. And that you can, there's free reign, right? And that everybody has a fair shot. That's not true either. Capitalism, when you think about it, if you don't have those resources to engage in that capitalist system, then the likelihood of you being crushed by a monopoly is very likely. And so where you have businesses like McDonald's, for example, McDonald's is a thriving billion-dollar business, billion-dollar industry. If you were to have a smaller mom and pop shop that did the same thing, the likelihood that they'd be crushed is very high, given that the people behind McDonald's have greater amounts of resources to move the company to thrive than that mom and pop shop of McDonald's. So that's something to think about. So I know I kind of hammered it in with the myth of meritocracy, but I think it's really important to understand how severe this particular belief is and how impactful it is. So when we think about meritocracy, the point is it stigmatizes people who are part of the working class, and it places that responsibility on the individual. Oops, let me go back. And it shames people. I don't think I can say that enough. So when we think about democracy, so now I'm getting more into the specifics of it. When you think about democracy, right? It's a political system that has governance and there's basic freedoms. Now, when you think about capitalism is an economic system. And with private ownership, labor means owners profit. When you think about Amazon, right? Everybody loves Amazon. Jeff Bezos makes a lot of money. And let's think of how that happened. So Jeff Bezos, Amazon out the gap was not that successful. And it wasn't until there were several people that invested in the company that it grew. Well, now it's a thriving company. Jeff Bezos has loads of money. Okay. Also to make note, the way that it happens is by cutting costs. And the way to cut costs is to have people work long hours with little pay or inappropriate pay. So Jeff Bezos may make 300 billion a year, not billion, excuse me, might make like $1 billion, where his workers might make 400. Excuse me. If we're looking at the end of the year, Jeff Bezos might make $1 billion or two in a year. I don't know how to do math, excuse me. Whereas someone who is his worker might make about 27. Or if they're higher up, they might make 60, even higher up than that, 70. You see the point? The point being is that when you're looking at people with who are in corporate or who are billionaires, there's a greater focus on their needs and the needs of their companies than on people. And with democracy and capitalism, the two, some people argue that the two can exist. That is not true. Well, that's my bias. My bias is that they cannot exist. But with democracy and capitalism, there's the conflation of democracy with capitalism. So the point is, we have this political system that emphasizes basic freedoms within a system, or working with a system that emphasizes the freedoms of private ownership. So can the two really coexist? So when we think about the political process, right, they provide regulatory laws and policies to protect workers, provide safeties, and maintain fair labor and banking practices, and also fund social safety net programs. Here's the problem. Money in politics, there has always been a chronic tension between the two. And the concern is that it pushes to promote capitalistic beliefs or capitalistic needs over health and well-being. We've seen that in this pandemic, right? When you had COVID relief, the COVID-19 pandemic relief underneath the Trump administration, it was basically trickle-down economics. So you had large amounts of money being provided to billion-dollar businesses compared to those of working-class families. $1,200 per person, per person bringing in the household money. Think about that. You got to make that last for a pandemic. Does Boeing Jets, $1 billion, if not $2 billion, more than that, dollar business, do they need $1 billion? No. Well, my opinion is no. Even further, when you think about people who are essential workers, right? People who are working at Burger King, people who are working at McDonald's, people who are working at supermarket stores, businesses. I feel like this is a valid point. Businesses, there are essential businesses. You need food. And at the same time, when you look at capitalism, in essence, what it's saying is everybody is replaceable. The quicker you can get more people in, the quicker amount of money you can make. Not really thinking about a person's health and well-being. So in order for people to cut costs and still make profit, they cut back on how many people are in the kitchen or working in that day, right? And they expect people to put out as much product. And I say, I'm talking about the workers here who are also people too. They expect them to put out as much product and then be okay with their health being put at risk. So that's something to think about as well. The point being is that we push capitalism over health and well-being. So now we're going to talk about classism in the United States within this historical context. And we have it documented in US American history. And we know that classism within US American history has been built upon the economic exploitation of Black and Indigenous people of color and poor folks, poor white folks. So we went through this race-based labor system where, number one, you had poor white folks and Black and Indigenous people of color, right? So there was this, I'm not going to say it was like this weird competition, but it wasn't a competition. What you had was that you had poor white folks making up part of the labor system. And you also had Black and Indigenous folks of color who were forced into this labor system. So when you look at who was really profiting, was really rich people, people with wealth. And so when we think about that story, right? I have verses up here is because that's what ended up happening. You had poor white folks and forced workers, forced slaves, that were pitted against each other by the elite. The elite recognized the dangers of the collaboration between these two groups. So instead, white elites would go to poor white folks and say, "You're better than those folks because because you're white, and because you're white, you have value." And poor white folks were also given jobs to enforce classist beliefs, classist structures against people of color. Within the United States, we've ignored stories of working class organizing. When we think about how we understand working class organizing, right? We talk about there's little references to labor unions or how they were formed or how they started. And so that's really important to recognize. When you think about indentured servants, tenant farmers, organization of immigrants, you don't see too much of their stories on their resistance towards classism. So something that I wanted to bring up is the Bracero program, and if you're familiar with it. So I have it up here if you want to go take a look at it. But basically, the Bracero program was an organized, it was an organized program between the United States and Mexico. Well, Mexican laborers would work at the farms and the fields of American land. And what ended up happening was that the workers lived in horrible working conditions and living conditions. So all that to say, you don't really hear stories about the resistance on programs like these. And so I really encourage folks to go out and to look this up. Well, let me go back. The point being, when you say the word labor union, managers and CEOs, they cringe. Well, let's look into why that might be. People recognize that they need they need equal pay, right? So I went back to this because I really want to emphasize the importance of hearing those stories of resistance, because those are the stories that don't get told. And I encourage folks to look up the different types of labor unions and the historical narratives around working class organizing. So when we think about class in the United States, right, it's a conversation killer, with the exceptions of talking about the middle class, right? And when you think about the middle class, they're used as a way to mute the difference between being rich and poor, right? It also provides avoidance of conflict and injustice. So when you think about the middle class, right, when people talk about not being paid fairly, but the conversation will point to the middle class. They're like, "Oh no, it's fine. Look, people who are in the middle class, they can make it." Well, so then they tend to be the scapegoat. And I'm talking about the middle class. They are used as ways to avoid that conversation. And then even further, the only time we talk about class is when we get these glimpses of the wealthy and the poor, right? So when we think about poverty and when we think about wealth, right, we get those extreme glimpses. And when I mean extreme, like you see images such as these, this here, and this here. The point being, when we talk about class, it's something that we're supposed to keep on the hush hush, nothing that we're supposed to talk about. And one of the reasons that people may not want to talk about it is because it makes people uncomfortable about having to talk about their own oppression, especially when they're not ready to take that race. So now I have some more myths for you. With America, it suggests that we are a middle-class nation. We are not. When we look at how many people contain wealth within America, it's substantially low. There are less people that contain most of the wealth of America, leaving middle-class folks, working class folks, and folks in poverty to figure out how to divide that. Class doesn't matter. Well, fun fact, class does matter. Because when we think about class privilege, this can provide you with access to these different resources, not having to think about certain things, right? Because it's handled for you. We live in a land of upward mobility. Now, growing up, this is something that I've been taught about America, is that if you work hard, you can move up, you can, live your life. Well, that's not all the way true. And I say that given what we know about classism. There are power structures in place, laws in place that favor and benefit people who are wealthy, people who are in corporate businesses. Last one, everyone has a chance to succeed. That's not true. When you think about shows like Shark Tank and shows like these instances when people win the lottery, these give the false sense that anyone can, have that chance. Well, that's not true. When you think about Shark Tank, there are millions of people, not millions, there are a large amount of people who showcase their work before they even get to that point. Before they even get the chance to be on, before they even get the chance to be featured on the show is what I mean. So you might have like 5, 6, 10 people getting coverage on their product when maybe there might have been 500 people that didn't even get invited to get on the show. That's something to think about. Even further, when we think about the lottery, yeah, a person has that chance to win the lottery, but the chances to win the lottery are extremely thin. Not even a statistician would do it. So let's look at the economic spectrum. The richest 20% holds 90% of total household wealth in the country. And when you think about national wealth, the wealthiest 1% owns 36% of national wealth. So what do you think about that? Thoughts and concerns? Now, going on to the other side, the poor. So let's look at it. More than 50% of US Americans live below the official poverty line. When you break that down, that's like a lot of people. And so when we look at the United States, 3.5 million people are homeless, and nearly 1.4 million of that, nearly 1.4 million children are homeless. And 1 out of every 5 children under 18 live in poverty. So when we have this comparison between people who are economically wealthy, economically rich, there are less rich people than there are poor people. Now, the middle class, they hold a very small share of the nation's wealth. And something to make note, it's going down, it's declining. So this is how it looks in a nutshell. So make note of this picture. So a word about class. We know that school performance and educational attainment, they strongly correlate with economic class. Here's the thing. There's a growing inequity where we're seeing children with that they don't have those economic resources. And then as a result, they're not able to achieve better in school. When we think about class mobility, it's actually lower than the rest of that of the industrialized world. So compared to Great Britain, compared to other European countries, our class mobility, the ability to move up, is a lot lower. And just because you have worker productivity doesn't mean you're going to increase class mobility or decrease inequity. Worker productivity basically just means a person is making more money. Taken together, class inequality is going to be there in the good and in the bad times. So when we look at the chances of being poor in America, right? I got this straight from your book. For white men and to some extent white women, 1 in 14. When you have a white woman, white identified woman who is the head of the household, 1 in 4. So this is where there's like a female householder with no husband present, or really no partner present, right? Hispanic men and women, 1 in 4. Hispanic female head, 1 in 2. Black men and women, 1 in 4. And Black women in head, 1 in 2. So when you look at it, when you think about other marginalized identities, this creates a very bigger problem. So when we look at class by itself, we know that there's a problem. And then when we look at it further, we're also seeing another big problem where it's disproportionate. When we look at Hispanic women, Latinx women, and Black American women, they're more likely to be poor. And this is conflated by their identities, their marginalized identities. Even further for Indigenous women and South Asian women. So all that to be clear is that while there's a large chance of people being poor, your identities, not identities, but when you think about the interlocking systems of oppression, these can facilitate even greater chances of being poor in America. So when we think about microassaults, right? Remember, these are like those overt instances of microaggression. These use of overt class references to describe a person. White trash, for example. These are used to describe people who are white and who are poor. Rednecks, hillbilly. Micro insults, demeaning messages, being offered hand-me-downs for pity. Even further saying you're so articulate for being a poor person. Like the hell? Denial of engagement because you have the wrong shoes. Now, I don't know about y'all, but that would aggravate the hell out of me. And then micro-invalidations. Fashion and lifestyle programming. When you think about wardrobes, dinner parties, daily activities of the wealthy, these are all showcased on the media. For example, when you think about e-news, like what a person's wearing. And these are like expensive wardrobes. Same thing with dinner parties. What do you need to wear to a dinner party? Activities of the wealthy. We think about social media, right? And TVs. While there's a lot of showcasing around people with wealth, right? There's a lot of showcasing of people who become wealthy based on a small probability. And it portrays that anybody can be economically successful. When you think about game shows, right? These are one of those main things. Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? Another one, My Sweet 16, Cribs, American Idol, and The Apprentice, right? So when you think about My Sweet 16 and Cribs, it's basically wealthy people showcasing their wealth. And don't get me wrong, back then I thought it was cool to watch My Sweet 16 and Cribs. Well, now looking back at it, I remember, at least for me, I remember feeling that, I wanted to have that. And then I feel really bad that I couldn't because my parents didn't make that much money. And then I ended up feeling shame in myself and to some extent internalizing that. And so when we think about those shows, while it's nice to see what other people have, there's a tendency to shame it's a tendency to shame people for what they don't have. American Idol and The Apprentice, they serve, like I mentioned before, they serve as shows to show that you can be famous, you can have wealth with a chance. Well, that's not always true, as we've seen with classism. Then even further, the portrayal of working class folks, right? A lot of times this tends to be like the sad sob story, or that it's shaming them and that they didn't work hard enough. When you think of undercover boss, these bosses, these CEOs going down in the corporate ladder, right? And meeting their workers on the ground and providing them with further opportunities when all they just need to do is provide them with proper pay. That's it. So when we think about undercover boss, right, there's a tendency to humanize the CEO and also show that they can give people the opportunities to move up. And at the same time, how come that wasn't done for other employees? Or even better, how come they're not getting paid? They're not getting raises. How come they're not getting raises? Yes. So something to think about. So some deep thoughts about class privilege, right? Class privilege impacts your financial future. Think about that job interview, right? Clothing and grooming. You need to have some money to have nice clothes, to get well groomed. Now, are there ways to where you can cut those corners? Definitely. However, as a whole, on average, what we've seen is that it costs money to go to an interview. When you think about, for your clothing and grooming, when you think about your references, you have to know people. And a lot of times you hear, sometimes it's not what you know, it's who you know. Well, if you don't have access to those social networks, that social capital, right, then the chances of you having people who you know that could help you are less. Even further, a resume. Some people may not know how to build a resume, or even further, a CV. And so something to think about is, think about how you're able to know about a resume. There's resources on campus that talks about how to do how to engage in a job interview, your references, how to create a resume. You have the Career Center that's available to you on hand. You pay for that. Other people who don't have that access, they don't know how to build a resume unless they have access to a phone. That's why phones are very vital at this point in time, because if you have internet, you can get access to a resume. But here's also the caveat too. If you don't have money, you can't pay for the internet. Then you have to hustle around and try to find someone who knows what a resume is. And even further, to critique your resume. Speech, how you talk is a big deal. And so I do my best to be as authentic as I am in my experience in talking with y'all. And I recognize the role that speech is really important. How you talk is very important. How you articulate certain things are important. Within, if you're committed to classism, right? With class privilege, you're exposed to education that talks about how you speak and how you articulate and pronounce words. So powerful social networks. This goes back into talking about references. If you're involved, if you have that class privilege, there's the chance that you are involved in those exclusive formal associations, and you have an informal web of influential neighbors, friends, and family. So, I do want to take some time to talk about what comes up for folks, like what feelings come up for you, what thoughts come up for you, because I recognize that this can be quite disappointing. But wait, there's more. It doesn't mean that you don't work hard. So classism sucks. It's horrible. But that doesn't mean that you abandon your goal and efforts. If you have a dream, if you want to be like that fashion designer, if you want to be like the most well-known fashion designer and you want Beyonce to call you, by all means, you can, that's a goal that you want to achieve, do it, be about it, be about that action. And just because you recognize the role of class privilege and classism doesn't mean you abandon that goal. If that's something that you're passionate about, you are going to do well. You're going to make it. And when I say that, I recognize my own class privilege. And I also recognize that I just told y'all about meritocracy, right? The point being is that just because you've learned about classism and you learned about how hard it is to move up, that doesn't mean you stop. That's the message. So the history of how we got here or where we are is really complicated. And something that I hear other people say, it's not about how you start, it's how you finish. To some extent, that is true. And hard work is still hard work, and fabulous is still fabulous. And so just because you have classism, that doesn't mean you stop working hard. And I'm hammering this message because I've seen so many people forego their goals simply because of classism. And so while you work towards your goals, I encourage you to advocate. Know your privilege, where it is, and examine your own stuff. Now that's very big, right? And I believe that you can definitely do this in advocating for yourself, advocating for others, and still work hard. So public policies can benefit everybody. Overall, we learned about classism. We talked about what it is. how it operates, and what what can we do with it. It does suck, but that doesn't mean you stop working, doesn't mean you stop fighting the good fight, and it doesn't mean you abandon yourself. So if you're about it, be about the action, and definitely continue to achieve your dream. If you have any questions about this lecture, please feel free to email me and I'll clarify any information that I can.